Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is shifting winds, why wildfires are changing. And it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Eleanor Edye. Eleanor, thank you so much for being here today and for bringing us this very important topic. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Thank you very much, Sunny, and hi to everybody who's joining live today. As Sunny said, my name is Eleanor, and I am one of our Canadian expedition leaders here with Natural Habitats. I come at this topic today not as a fire scientist, but as somebody who lives and works in areas where fires are integral to the survival of the whole ecosystem. So I've always had a large interest in fire. Probably those of you who are here today also do. When I think about fires and I stop and I think about what they mean to us and to humans and to life on this planet, we can think about fire as being really central to the human experience, right? We cook with fire, whether it's electric or whether it's gas heat. We heat our homes with fire. We power our cars with lots of tiny little fires as we use our internal combustion engines. But today we're going to be talking about wildfires, and these are different than the multitude of tiny fires that surround us every day. Wildfires, I think, is a scary term. The implication of the word wildfire is that these are fires that are out of control, that they are apart from the human experience and not controlled by us in any way, as opposed to all these little controlled fires that make our lives easy. So as we are kind of moving into November and wrapping up what we call the official fire season of 2023 in North America, I want to talk about wildfires, what causes them, how they shaped our world, and ultimately getting into how the wildfire season of 2023 in the Northern Hemisphere was a surprise in its severity to a lot of people. So I want to kick this off with a quick talk about some notable wildfires, because there have been some really incredible wildfires that have happened within human history, and then we'll kind of work out how we got here. And I do want to start with what I would consider for me the instigating moment for this presentation, which was the 2023 air quality in North America. So if you lived really in the northwest of North America, or of the US in particular, pretty well almost anywhere in Canada this summer, and especially the US Northeast, you probably experienced air quality conditions that you've never seen before, right? In New York City, the air pollution ranked as some of the worst in the world, and all of this was due to wildfire smoke that was blowing in. In New York, it was coming in from northern Quebec. Millions of people were affected by this poor air quality. The air quality in New York City reached an air quality index of 342, which is an incredibly hazardous level. Flights were halted, people's health was affected, and it was something that you could not ignore. Even if you'd never paid attention to wildfires before, you couldn't ignore the fact that all of a sudden everybody was talking about the air quality, and even if you didn't want to talk about the air quality, you couldn't avoid it every time you looked out the window or wanted to go for a run, but you couldn't because you couldn't breathe the air. So the air quality index is done based on a number of particulates and other things that are found in the air, their impact on human health. It includes looking at things like ozone, like particulate pollution, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and we give a ranking to all of those major air pollutants, giving us our kind of color or level for the day. This is kind of just important to understand, because for decades, we have seen such strong environmental protections, bringing our overall air quality in North America to better and better and better levels. And this summer was not one where we saw this happening. And it wasn't because of factories or cars or anything like that, at least not directly. It was due to wildfire smoke. You may have become a lot more familiar with smoke forecast apps than you ever had been before, where we could look at where the smoke was likely to move in the next 24 or 48 hours and what your air quality was likely to be. And maybe you started planning outings more around the air quality forecast than you did around, the rain forecast. So it was a different way of kind of moving through the world for a lot of people. Like I said, millions and millions of people were affected by poor air quality who usually would not have had a summer experience like that. So it was a big kind of a banner year for a lot of folks having to interact with fires in a way that you may never have had to before. But these fires are not unique to 2023. They were simply unique to where the smoke got to. If we take a step further back, there have been big fires kind of for a long time. In 2016, there was a large wildfire that affected the city of Fort McMurray in Alberta. It was an extremely notable wildfire in that it required the evacuation of the entire city of Fort McMurray in a very short period of time. Less than a day. It was a very fast-moving fire that affected a large portion of the town, as well as a number of oil and gas refineries in the area too. It was a year of record-breaking temperatures and low humidity, and the fire just moved incredibly quickly towards the city. By the time this fire was extinguished, and even if you heard about the Fort McMurray wildfire, you maybe didn't keep hearing about it as it kept going, because the evacuation was done in a day and the rebuilding, of course, is still ongoing. But that fire actually took 13 months to fully burn out and caused the loss of 2,300 square miles of forest, releasing 100 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from that burn. While I'm going to be talking mainly about North America, because we are talking about the 2023 North American wildfire season mostly, you can't really talk wildfires without at least mentioning Australia. The Australian flora is built to burn in a few ways that we'll discuss right away, with a lot of species, including eucalyptus, that release volatile chemicals that actually increase the fire risk and intensity of fires. And Australia has had so many varying years of wildfires that they have lots of different ways of recording what their worst ever year was. Everything from the most number of deaths, which happened in the 2009 bushfires, to the most amount of land and forest loss, which was almost 300 million acres lost in a different year. That was back in 2009 as well. And then the 2019-2020 bushfire season, or Black Summer, that you may be more familiar with because it happened most recently, wasn't a record breaker in terms of how many people died or how much structure loss was happened, but it was considered to be a mega fire season. And we had a loss of a lot of forested land. And it was actually estimated that over 3 billion terrestrial vertebrates, mostly reptiles, were affected by these fires. And some endangered species were actually driven to extinction directly from these particular fires in that year. Now, before we move on to talking about the how of fire, there's one other fire I want to talk about, just to give you an idea of the scale of fires that are possible, because this is a fire that you probably have never heard of, and this is the Chinchaga Fire of 1950. So this is the fire that burned across British Columbia and Alberta in the early fall of 1950. You can see that red outline along the provincial border there in an area that was pretty well nearly uninhabited. Over 4.2 million acres burned as a result of that single fire, and it was the single largest recorded fire in North American history. There was nothing to be done with a fire of that size besides let it burn out. And it created large amounts of smoke, creating what was known as the Great Smoke Pall of 1950. And because we didn't have satellites in the air to, be able to explain what was going on here, and the fire itself was not well publicized, the smoke was a mystery to many. Because that fire was actually so powerful, most of the smoke didn't end up in the lower atmosphere like it did in 2023. This fire actually crossed atmospheric boundaries and put most of its smoke up into the higher level atmosphere. So instead of being able to smell smoke and know that something was burning somewhere, what it looked like was that a curtain was drawn across the sun. And there was a lot of confusion around what was happening then, and a lot of conspiracy theories that resulted until the newspapers got their stories out on that. So while this is the largest fire ever recorded, we do know from geological history that this is almost definitely not the largest fire ever. We have other evidence regarding what fires have been like in the Earth's past, because when we think about fire, it's actually really interesting to note that in the 4-point-something billion years of the planet's existence, conditions have actually not been conducive for wildfire until the last 400 million years or so. So for the first majority, like 90% of our planet's life, fire was not a thing because we didn't have an adequate amount of oxygen in the atmosphere to allow a fire to burn. So the chemistry just wasn't there. As plant life began to grow and as plant life moved onto land around that 400 million year ago mark, that is when we started seeing conditions being right for the potential for fires. And all of the kind of plant fossils that you can see on the screen here are all early examples of terrestrial plant life that has been found with evidence of charring on it. And our first evidence for wildfires is from 420 million years ago in the form of it's called a rhinophytoid. It's a plant on the far left there. It's a very, extinct now type of spore-bearing plants. And it was, as far as we know to date, the first thing to spontaneously burn on planet Earth. Now, as time went on and as more and more plants began to grow on the terrestrial side of things, as opposed to in the water where you're much less likely to get wildfires, we had plant communities start to have to develop that had to be responsive to fires, because when you have a lot of plant life, they are going to produce oxygen as a byproduct. And what we know about oxygen, and we'll talk about, is that it's one of the main conditions for the ability to have fire. And the more oxygen you have, the more likely you are to have fires, and the more likely fires are to be severe. So this graph here shows you the oxygen concentration of our planet that has actually been inferred mostly from evidence of fires. More fires, more oxygen. Fewer fires, less oxygen. And it's due to how much biomass there is producing oxygen on Earth, essentially at a time. Now, today we have an average oxygen level of around 21%, but it's not always been at that level. Sometimes it's been lower. Most of the time, since plants have moved their way onto land, that oxygen content has actually been quite a bit higher, giving us much more severe fires. And we should be actually pretty happy that we are not living through those conditions. But with this kind of move towards these very fire-dominated land masses and these high fuel, high atmospheric oxygen, plants had to adapt and communities had to adapt. And starting around 125 million years ago in the fossil record, we start to see plant communities develop that are fire-adapted communities. That not just one species within the community, but the entire community itself is responsive to fire and actually requires fire for that community to be left intact. So the ecosystems that are most well known for this characteristic, for burning and regrowing and burning and regrowing, and that is how that they refresh themselves, include prairies, savanna, chaparral, as well as coniferous forests, like those found throughout a lot of Canada, especially northern Quebec there. All of these ecosystems have evolved with fire as an essential contributor to their habitat vitality and the habitat renewal. Without fire in these ecosystems, you cannot have those ecosystems as groups of species as they currently exist. This image here that you're looking at here is a burned boreal forest. And I do want to stop and say that as an expedition leader in Canada, this has been the year when I got asked so many questions about wildfire smoke. Are we going to experience smoke on our trips? Are these fires dangerous? Why are the fires burning? And it was interesting to me as somebody who, lives and works in a fire-dominated ecosystem, how a lot of people don't always think about fires and how much of an important role they play in these ecosystems. Because to me and to anybody else who lives and works in these areas, what you mostly care about is the fire right there and is it going to bother me? Because fires are always happening, and fires, in fact, need to happen for these forests to keep being these types of forests. It's much like if you live in Florida and that a hurricane is going to come at some point. It might be tomorrow, it might be in 5 years, it might be in 20 years, but at some point, because you live in that region where hurricanes are a thing, a hurricane will impact where you live. In the boreal forest fires work the same way. And as we talk about these different ecosystems, I just want to mention a few brief adaptations of ways plants and plant communities have become adapted to fire. In some cases, they've become resilient against burning, so they're difficult to burn. But in fact, a lot of them have embraced the fire and used them as a driver of the life cycle and to renew the entire ecosystem. This is one of my favorite plants from Australia. This is what's called a grass tree or xanthorrhea, if you want to use the Latin name. This one is a well-groomed grass tree. When you see them in nature, those grassy bits just kind of come all the way down the stem. This is showing a common husbandry technique to reduce wildfire risk around these trees, which is trimming that dead skirt of leaves around the stem so that it's less likely to catch on fire. But in nature, when we're not looking at one in a garden, those full skirts are actually important, not just to encourage fire and renewal of the ecosystem, but protect other species that live in the area, because underneath those skirts, it'll actually be quite a bit cooler and more humid than out in the direct sun in the summer. But these plants, as you can imagine from when you look at them, it looks like if you walk past them with a lit match, they will go up in flames, and that is indeed what they are built for. After a fire, they are very, very quick to renew themselves. Those outer layers will simply burn up. The outside of the stem gets scorched, and this actually triggers new growth and flowering in these species. So seeing those flower spikes in the new growth is often, the first sign that the plant survived and that they are now going to go on to sexually reproduce, make some seeds, and drop seeds in that newly exposed soil. So it's the way by which these plants work and that they replenish the seed bank. Australia's got so very many examples of fire-adapted species. I mentioned that eucalyptus actually produces volatile chemicals to drive fires faster. This is a Banksia. It belongs in the family Proteaceae. It's endemic to Australia. Most, but not all, Banksias are driven by fire as well. So I'll show you what it looks like after it's pollinated and produces seeds. So this is what the seed head looks like, and you can see that there are lots of little fruits that have sealed up, and then on the left-hand side, they're open up. These cones will only open to release their seeds after the heat of fire comes through and physically melts the resin that holds those fruits together. So this characteristic of cones or fruits being held together by a thick waxy substance that gets melted off by fire and then the seeds get released is found in a lot of fire-adapted habitats and in fire-adapted species. So the Banksia here, the eucalyptus has a lot of members like that as well, and a number of common species in North America's boreal forest do as well. This is a really commonly found one, especially in the western side of North America. This is lodgepole pine. It is the provincial tree of Alberta. And you can look at the cones on this plant and see that there are no natural openings in this cone to release a seed. The scales on these cones are held in place again by a resin bond. And it's not until a fire goes through and kind of melts or burns off that resin that the seeds can actually be released. So those cones may remain on the tree for 10 to 20 years and not be released and start to germinate until a fire comes through, removing all of that overhanging vegetation that would otherwise get in its way. So when we have areas that are really, really dominated by frequent fires like this, we end up with really interesting patchwork forests. So this image here is all lodgepole pine that you can see, and if you look at it, you'll notice that all of the pines look about the same size, both width and in terms of heights. You can guess looking at this that this was a forest burn that went through. All of those lodgepole pines started to germinate, and they're all the exact same age because they all started growing just as soon as that fire had gone through. So lodgepole pines are really good colonizers, and then they grow in these what we call single age stands. So the entire stand like that is of the same age. Whereas if you walked, half a mile or 10 miles over in a different direction, you would come to a forest stand that had also probably been affected by fire at some point and was also a single age stand, but it was a different age stand. It might be older or it might be younger. And this patchwork network really has created the ability for different species of birds and animals and other plants to specialize within there as well. So there are some species of birds, for example, that specialize in recently burned forests. Some species of plants and other and animals that are only found in older growth forests. So if you are one of those individuals and you need to get yourself to a patch of old forest because that's where your food's found, you are able to find entire patches that match your habitat needs. All of these trees, the ones that you look at here, all the ones I'm going to show you, every single tree in the boreal forest, unless a human comes and cuts it down, a tree in the boreal forest can expect to burn, on average, between every 50 and 150 years. So when a tree dies, like sometimes you do get standing dead wood, but almost every tree in the boreal forest, which is our single largest ecosystem on this planet, is going to burn about every 100 years, plus or minus 50 years. So every single species then within the boreal forest, which is again a really, really huge ecosystem, also has to be adapted to that the nature of the life cycle. There are going to be fires. This is how it renews itself, and this is how it functions as an ecosystem. So these are just a really small list of examples of some of the fire-adapted species. And I want to pause for a second, I want to ask you a question that I want you to think about what the answer might be. I've talked about these different ecosystems that burn and how they are fire adapted. How much of the terrestrial world do you think is part of a fire regime, meaning that fire is expected to come through at some distinct interval? And how much of the planet do you think burns every year as part of a natural fire cycle? So let's ease into this question a little bit. As I mentioned, fire-adapted ecosystems developed around 125 million years ago. So all of these have had a lot of time to establish themselves across the planet. So if we look at the left-hand side colors there, those are areas where we expect to see frequent or regular fires. These include the boreal forests, our deciduous coniferous forests, like Mediterranean type forests, like chaparral, very dry Mediterranean types, grasslands, deciduous tropical forests and tree savannas, so very grass-driven ecosystems and very drier areas as well. All of those we expect to burn at some point in their lifetime, because that is how ecosystem renewal and revitalization happens. Areas that don't burn without human intervention for the most part, all of our wetter tropical forests are deciduous temperate forests, so things like maple forests and beechwood forests, and then deserts, because deserts have very little to burn overall. So look at those colors on the left and see how much of the planet they cover. We actually have around 40% of our terrestrial world is considered to be a fire-prone ecosystem with frequent or regular fires. If I zoom in here to Canada and we look at all the fires that have occurred in a 40-year period between 1980 and 2021, so I guess 41 years, all of this orange represents land that has burned over that 40-year time frame. Now, the boreal forest isn't really shown here on a map, but it sweeps down in about the middle of Canada and kind of makes a little smiley face. You're basically looking at the shape of the boreal forest in orange there. So not all of it has burned in that 40-year period, but probably around 40 to 50% of it has burned in that 40-year period. And that would be roughly what we'd expect knowing that the expected fire interval in that region as a whole is every 50 to 150 years. So that the forest for sure burns. If we look at the US, we don't have the same type of map for the US, but just to give you an idea, these are areas of the US that are more fire prone, especially more fire prone for large fires. So darker colors means more big fires. Lighter colors means none or very few large fires. So to give you an idea, it's that coniferous forest band that goes up and down the Rocky Mountains, and then our drier vegetation, our grasslands and more Mediterranean style vegetation that's found especially along the California coastline there, very prone to burning. In the USA, just to give you some example numbers, on every year there's about 60,000 wildfires annually and about 7 million acres burned annually. In comparison to Canada, the US has more recorded fires, but a similar number of acres burned every year. So let's just take a second and look globally here at what's the fire level looks like in terms of how much land burns every year. Okay, so here's a global map of fire frequency. So how much of the land in a certain area is burned every year as a percentage. If you think about it in the boreal forest, for example, if the replacement levels is about every 100 years, you'd expect to see about a 1% burn every year in Canada for the most part, right? When we look at this map, it makes sense. You can see that the areas that are most often burned are those in Northern Australia and those through kind of those bands in Africa as well. What this map doesn't show is the proportion of fires that are human caused versus lightning caused. In areas where we see a high level of burned fraction, so we are seeing areas here where the land is burned every other year, and all of the land is burned every other year on average. A lot of these represent areas where land management is done with heavy use of fires. And I will talk about land management practices in a bit as we progress through, because in a lot of times we are used to thinking of fires as land management as bad, but in many cases it is part of a normal fire regime. So hold that thought in your head. But here is our answer. Annually, global average, about 2.7% of our terrestrial world burns every single year. Is that close to what you guessed? Or was it way off? Because having a number pretty close to 3% burned every year across the world might sound really high, but there's reasons for this, right? We can go back to the basics of fire, like I want to say fire biology, but it's really more fire chemistry, right? This is our fire triangle. It's the three things that come into making fire. Oxygen to feed the fire, fuel for it to have something to burn, and heat, because heat creates the volatilization of chemicals. Because it's not a solid that burns, or it's not a liquid that burns, it's the volatile gases that are released as those items heat up for ignition. So that is why things, different materials have different flash points. It's easier to burn paper than it is to burn wood, for example. You know this. If there's no fuel, nothing can burn. And oxygen drives the chemistry behind this whole interaction. So this is at the level of a single flame that we're working with oxygen and heat and fuel. We can look at bigger scales as we talk about wildfires, though, because it's not just about do you have oxygen, do you have heat, do you have fuel? Yes, we have all these things all around the globe all the time. To have a wildfire, we're going to start to look on a scale of days and of a bigger scale spatially, and we're going to start to look at weather and topography and fuel. So in this context, like we still need heat to ignite the fire, but topography becomes more important. So this topography meaning, you know, is it hilly? Are you going uphill or downhill? It's important for aiding fire spread because if you're going uphill, the heat will rise. It preheats the fuels that are further up the slope, and the fire can spread much more quickly going uphill than it can downhill. As we start to look at weather instead of oxygen, we're talking about winds that bring fresh oxygen in to feed the fire. And fuels, it's not just about do you have fuel, but what kind of fuels do we have? Are they dry? Are they wet? Are they things that are full of volatile chemicals that want to burn or not? And the fire regime is at a bigger scale still, and we'll get there in a few minutes. So let's take a look at that middle triangle there, our wildfire triangle. So we know we're going to have fire because fire happens, lightning strikes happen, humans drop cigarette butts. But what actually dictates how a wildfire behaves? So there's lots. So I mentioned fuels. We're talking about fuel types. So is it coniferous trees? Are they deciduous trees? Is it grass? Are the fuels themselves small, like pieces of grass or like fine wood shavings, or are they large standing trees? The fuel size affects the rate at which they burn. Some things burn faster and some things burn slower. Is the fuel all lying on the ground or is it standing up? Are there fuels between the two levels? So are there what we call ladder fuels that bring the fires from the ground up into the trees? Is that fuel wet or dry? What's the moisture content of that fuel? Weather, like I mentioned, we can bring in oxygen through the wind, but we can also look at factors like relative humidity, because as humidity drops, we start to see fires being more able to easily burn, and it dries out those fuels more quickly as well. The temperature, the amount of precipitation, all of this is going to affect the behavior of a fire as it grows. And I did mention topography as well, so the physical features of that Earth surface. I talked a little bit about uphill and downhill, but it also involves the direction the slope is facing, for example. So if you're facing southwards in the northern hemisphere, those southern facing slopes are exposed to the sun for longer, so that it's warmer and drier and easier to burn. Does it have to cross water? Does it have to cross any other natural barriers to fire? Are there swamps or wetlands, or are there dried out peatlands, for example, that can keep a fire burning for a long time? So it's a very complicated triangle that comes into what that fire is actually going to behave as. If you spend time in the forest, and I'm guessing many of us do, different regions have fire danger rating systems to help us kind of make more sense in a very concrete level about what the fire danger is in a certain area. And all of these things that we just talked about go into making that fire danger rating. So when they're thinking about, okay, if a fire starts, how is that fire going to behave? If a lightning strikes here tonight, is it going to be a slow smoldering fire that gets put out because everything's wet? Or is it going to catch and move quickly because we've had days of hot, dry weather and there's lots of standing material for this fire to burn? So this, all of those factors we talked about in the fire triangle go into a model that comes out and gives us a fire danger rating system. And we have one in Canada. You have a really similar one in the States. The Australian fire danger rating system is very well known as well. The Canadian model is actually one that has been used throughout a lot of the world because it's a lot more neutral in how it can be used, and it can be brought into new areas and adapted for those areas. But different countries that have fire-prone areas will also often tend to develop their own specialized rating system. And Australia is kind of one of the most known because they've gone through a fairly recent shift where you no longer have a low fire danger rating system. You simply have a no rating system. That's that little white bar at the far bottom left for days when you don't need to take any proactive action as a community. But anything else, as you move into moderate, high, extreme, or catastrophic, the expectation is with this scale that action is always being taken by communities to mitigate that risk of fire. Now, I'm not going to get too into the model because I think models are most interesting when you are a modeler, but it's always kind of fun to know what the behind the scenes stuff is. All of the things that we just talked about with the fire triangle, how dry it is, the drought code, what is the moisture of the forest floor, the duff moisture code, the fine fuel moisture code. So we're looking at the moisture levels here. We look at things like the fuel buildup, so how much standing material is there. All of this goes into giving you a fire weather index, and that is used by planners and modelers and people who deal with the wildland fires on our behalf to keep us as safe as possible. There's also another part of that that goes into the fire behavior prediction system, and things like fuels and weather and topography and all those other parts we talked about as well come into that too. So there's two sets of models that come through, and it's not just, is fire going to happen? It's also, if fire happens, what is it likely to do? So there's a whole science behind the fire sciences that is incredibly well studied, and many, many countries have people who spend, you know, their entire working careers working within these models to improve them and to keep human habitation safe. So that's kind of what goes into giving us those ratings. But all of these behaviors that we're talking about can give us real on the ground things that we can see. Again, it's a little bit different depending where you are, but we have different rankings for fires depending how that fire is behaving. These are some of the predictions that, like, these are all fed into the model, and they also come out of the model as to what we're likely to see. I'm going to go through what these ranks are, because even if you are just out in the woods and you witness a fire, to be able to describe something correctly, but also for you to understand the behavior of that fire to keep yourself as safe as possible is important too. And I do want to say that I think a fire of any rank tends to be pretty scary to people if you're around it, but there are some that are inherently, of course, more dangerous than others. When we start with our rank 1 fires, these are ground fires. They burn mainly in decayed roots below ground and in the duff layer in the soil. So all of the compacted dead plant materials. It smolders. It doesn't really move. There's no open flame. And it's very, very, very slow. Now, often these things like this can stay in the ground for a very long time. These are often lightning strike fires. They can be extinguished often quite rapidly if they're observed. But usually what happens in terms of fire management, unless this is something happening very close to where humans live, these are let go because they will often self-extinguish as rain happens or as weather gets colder. However, it's also possible for ground fires like this to sustain themselves for months and even through the winter as a slowly smoldering fire in that ground layer there. As we progress through the rankings, rank 2 is what we call a low vigor surface fire. So it's visible flame at this point moving along the ground. It's unorganized or inconsistent, so it's fire moving very slowly. It can often be addressed really quickly using ground crews with very basic, like, water delivery system or heavy equipment just to move some earth around. It tends to be a very well-controlled fire. And then rank 3 is also a surface fire, but it is a vigorous surface fire with an organized flame front. So you can actually see those flames advancing along the ground in an organized manner. When we move up to rank 4, this is where we get the fire moving from the ground up into the canopy layer. So this is a rank 4 fire that's coming up right here. It is a surface fire, so there's still fire along the surface, but what we call torching or candling. So individual trees are catching on fire in rank 4. So there's still an organized flame front, but we start to see these trees, individual trees, not the whole stand, catching on fire. This is where, you know, as fire managers or as people who might be in the backcountry, or maybe you have a cabin close by, this is the point where everybody kind of throws up the flags and goes, this fire is moving in the wrong direction, because it's now moved into the canopy, and different behavior can happen in the canopy than on the ground. As we move into rank 5 and rank 6, these are all now fires moving into the canopy where the tops of the trees are burning. And I should note, for that previous one that we're talking about, for a fire to get from the ground, which is almost always where fires start, they don't start up in the canopy, they start on the ground. For a fire to make that transition from the ground up into the trees themselves, you have to have a certain amount of conditions that are met. You usually have low humidity and very dry fuels, and/or you have what are called ladder fuels, meaning things like bushes or standing branches that allow the fire to ladder themselves to climb up a tree to reach that canopy. So canopy fires or crown fires burn up top. They may burn all the way through. They may just leapfrog along, burning the tops of the trees. It's a very transformative moment for a fire because there's so much mobility once the fires move into the crowns. And this is typically when we start to see fires moving very, very fast on the landscape. In each case, like a rank 6 fire has a very organized front. There's fire in the trees, and the main difference between a rank 5 and a rank 6 is as you move into that last ranking, a rank 6, this is when we see violent fire behavior. You may actually see things like fire whirls or fire tornadoes, and you will see things like what we call long range spotting. So you have things like sparks being flown off into the air, landing somewhere far away because there's so much energy to transport that spark, and independent new fires beginning far downwind of where that original fire was. So it's a very, very dangerous and dynamic system when you get to a rank 6 for sure. So all of this sounds pretty scary, right? So it's not hard to understand why for many years in North America, our policies around wildfire were basically stop it from happening. If it happens, stop it right away. For over 100 years, we had very, very aggressive suppression of fires. And I do want to mention here that I'm talking about fire suppression as a policy of the colonial states. We had different burns traditionally used by the indigenous people of North America as part of their maintenance of the habitats that they lived in. It was not until we had the colonial state coming in as Canada and as the US that burns were pretty well shut out across the landscape. Everywhere from within the national parks and national forests to any individually owned land, all of this was seen as resource loss as well as being dangerous to human life, which makes sense. So the policies were suppress, suppress, suppress. Everything had to be put out as soon as possible. And we had, like I said, by the second half of the 19th century, this was the policy, and it stayed in place until the 1960s, 70s, 80s, depending where you are of the 20th century. When people started to realize that these environments, these ecosystems could not renew themselves without fire, and that one of the first areas that was noticed by researchers was in the giant sequoia forests of the West Coast. Turns out you don't get baby sequoia without fire. So all of these years of suppression led to no recruitment of seedlings. What this has meant, unfortunately, across North America, remember how I said that an average tree in the forest is going to burn about every 100 years, plus or minus 50 years? So what's happened to all these parks and all these federally managed lands after 100 years of fire suppression? Well, it's meant that instead of our network of patchwork forest, where we have a lot of different habitats that come together to make the boreal forest or the montane forest, that we had all of these very, very old growth forests that were overdue, like so overdue for burning, that as we got to this point and as fires continued to go on, they were so difficult to control because that ecosystem was just waiting to burn. It was ready to burn. As the trees get older, they become easier to burn. And it's meant that we've had some incredibly large wildfires in these previously managed areas because we're playing catch up from all these lands that should have been burned some time ago. These are the Yellowstone fires of 1988, which were, of course, a really well-known big conflagration, really due to 100 years of incorrect land management practices before that. So as we get better at this, we've learned that in the most part, wildfires should be let burn unless it's causing any issues of public safety or for infrastructure protection. And we're actually starting to do a lot more management with prescribed burning. So going out there and starting fires ourselves in a managed way when conditions aren't likely to produce a massive out of control fire, and burning those patches of forest so that they're ready to regrow on a time scale that works for us and works for the forest instead of waiting for it to happen naturally. So we're now recognizing that fire is such an integral component in the function of these ecosystems and of the biodiversity of these habitats, and that all of these organisms require fire. We need to make sure that they are able to get it. Otherwise, it's, as we've seen and learned, it comes back at us. So whether you're in national parks in Canada or in the US, all of our federally managed lands that have fire as part of their regime are expected to have fire in a managed way now as part of their management plans. Now, all that being said, we can recognize this in federally managed areas, but when you start to introduce people into the mix, it's a lot harder to have that conversation, because if you live in a place and there's a forest beside you and you see a fire coming down at you, it's a lot harder for humans to accept the fact that wildfires need to happen. So fire suppression is still really favored by a lot of people. And there are a lot of areas where we built into forests where it's actually, we've created the need for it as well. So I kind of love this photo and I kind of hate this photo. It shows you a new neighborhood that's been built. It's gorgeous. You've got access to all of these forest trails around you. Well, think about the fire management and the fire suppression that has to happen when you have all these standing forests around you and your house is just a matter of feet from a forest that is ready to burn. So it's got both sides to it there. And that brings us to talking about fire regime, our big time scale fire triangle. So we're looking here at big amounts of space and we're looking at big amounts of time. And our three sides to our fire regime triangle are ignition, so how many times fires are starting, the vegetation of the area, and the climate. So not weather now, but we're talking climate. And the fire regime, all of this describes the patterns that we're looking at large scale. So when does fire happen in the seasons? Is it seasonal? Does it happen year round? How often does it happen? How big do those fires tend to be? Are those fires patchy or are they contiguous? What type of fires are we seeing and what severity of fires are we seeing? Are they all ground fires? Are they all surface fires, or are they all rank 6 crown fires? Now, we talked a little bit about vegetation just now and how we as humans have impacted vegetation through our long-term fire suppression efforts. So we've seen across the board, really in North America and a lot of other areas too, that we have had a big part in changing what the vegetation of these forests look like, because we've stopped them from burning, which means that a lot of forests are extra ready to burn right now. There's another part to that as well. We also see areas where we have shifts in vegetation as climate warms. So we do know that we are going through a period of climate change. I do a lot of work in the north, for example, and we see areas where we're switching from a tundra vegetation to a forest vegetation. Tundra doesn't burn, forest will. So that's a change as well on the ground of what the fire regime of those areas will look like. Now, ignitions, where are those ignitions coming from? Well, it's both us and it's nature. So when more fires are started, more wildfires are likely. And we know that humans start fires. Sometimes it's on purpose and sometimes it's not. And fires that humans start tend to be early in the season. So early in the summer. And there's some reasons for that. Usually it's because this is when humans like to go and recreate in the forest, but the forest in a lot of areas will have low moisture levels because the ground is still frozen and they're not able to draw out water from the soil yet. So it's a really high risk time to be in the forest because everything is really ready to quickly burn in the spring. So that's when we tend to see the majority of human caused fires. And then as we progress through the summer, we see more lightning caused fires. Now, are we seeing an increase in that? Actually, a little bit, yes, because as the climate is changing, we see more lightning being generated. So more lightning strikes means more probability of ignition as we move through this. And Our models show this as well, that as the climate changes and as we see more ignitions, that we are likely to be seeing in the next 10, 20, 40 years, both more frequent and bigger fires through pretty well everywhere that currently burns right now. Now, these are projections, but I do want to point out that they are well-modeled projections. They are well-verified projections, and it's almost a guarantee at this point that we're going to see more wildfire activity and a change in fire regime in the boreal forest as we move into the next 20 years. And this is partially because of what we talked about, but also partially because of the climate feedback loop. As we are warming the climate, the fuel dries out, we have more ignition through wildfires, more fires burn, releasing carbon dioxide, and then the whole cycle keeps going around where we have more fires burning because we just warm things up a little bit more. So it really does feed back. If you're wondering, are we seeing these changes already on the ground yet? We are. It still is smaller than the number of trees that get removed by people. So that brown bar underneath there are the area that is removed by fires annually. And that black line running across there shows you the running average. So we are seeing an increase in the amount of forests being consumed by wildfire as time carries on here. And if we want to talk specifically about 2023, how did that go for us? Well, 2023 was a rough year. We're going to take into account all that we just talked about here and talk about 2023 for a few minutes. Was this year worse? Were we seeing changes in fire regimes and wildfire behavior, and why? So I did do a talk earlier this summer about El Niño and what we were likely to see, and in fact, pretty well all of that has come to fruition. It has been a year of extreme weather events. We saw more fires start in 2023 than we have on average pretty well ever before. They started earlier and they continued longer. So we actually had in Canada over close to 60,000 fire starts in a year, and that is on an order of magnitude higher than we usually see in Canada. In terms of the area burned, it was also quite a bit more. So this is a map of Canada. I showed you before kind of how all those pieces connected up to draw us the boreal forest, but here we're looking at year by year. So the darker reds there are older fires, going up to white being 2023 and what that has been like. And it was truly a shocking year in terms of the amount of land that was burned. It started early, it ended late, it's still going on even though it's officially over. And we burned over 18 million hectares, when normally we would expect around 2.5 million hectares to burn. So we saw a lot of bigger fires, we saw a lot of more severe fires, and we saw more fires overall. We have slowed down at this point, but there are still fires ongoing right now, even if we're not feeling it in the air right now. So with all that, just to kind of wrap up and to think about wildfire safety, because we are likely to see, if models are correct, we're likely to see similar wildfire season in 2024. It is predicted to be a very strong El Niño next year, and we'll continue on with this type of behavior with very low moisture levels, higher temperatures, and more extreme fire behavior. The recommendations that come out of that information are making sure that our houses are safe, especially in high-risk hazard areas. So if you live somewhere along the wildland-urban interface, meaning that you're kind of at the edge of the forest and you have trees around you, to make sure that you're removing potential fuels from the areas around your house. Likely, if you live in an area like this, you're already having conversations like this with your local planning district and family and friends and neighbors about ways that you can keep property safe, even though you might live in a higher risk area. Simply keeping areas around your house clear of fuel is a really major way of keeping your house and property safer. But with all this, we also have bigger picture things to think about. We do really want to know and recognize that fire is a critical part of the ecology of all of these regions, and how all of these ecoregions have evolved to being what they are. There are still lots of areas where fire suppression is a really big thing, and fire has to be integrated into how we work with all of these spaces that we use. WWF has some recommendations for how we address wildfires and how we think about how we interact with them. And that includes both, addressing the climate crisis and reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we're emitting, while actually increasing the amount that we are burning on purpose. So using prescribed burns to remove standing dead fuel to make those areas safer at a time when it's safe to burn, as opposed to waiting until a massive wildfire happens. Also taking those independent and individual responsibilities, like making sure that your house is as safe as possible, to build safer and greener if you're building new properties, and to make sure that we are advocating for safety and developing safety plans as much as we can, knowing that fire is a part of our planet. And whether it's more or whether it's less in any single year, it's always going to be part of our planet. And we're just becoming more aware of it these days. So I think it's a really fascinating topic. I hope that it's brought you some new knowledge today, and I'm happy to hand things over for questions.
Eleanor, thank you so much. That was so informative and thought-provoking and just helpful to get that big picture understanding of what's happening on a large scale. So thank you so much for consolidating all that information for us. We do have a bunch of questions and a little bit of time, so let me just see what I can dish out to you quickly. Let's start with, so people talk about lightning being one of the big ignitions of these fires. Is there a clear understanding of how the lightning starts the fires? Does it strike the canopy, the limbs, the trunk, the ground? Just any more clarity about how lightning actually ignites or where it ignites fires?
So it's so dependent on the situation. If we think about how lightning behaves, it usually takes the most direct path from one point to another, right? But there are other factors that come into this as well, in terms of whether the ground is wet and et cetera, et cetera. There's lightning science that happens. Sometimes and often lightning hits trees. When lightning hits trees as part of a thunderstorm and you have saturated ground and the tree canopy is moist and it's got, fresh green leaves on it, that is in fact unlikely to go on to cause a bigger fire, because we don't have the other parts of that fire triangle, that wildland fire triangle, that we need for that to develop into a bigger fire. Where we often see lightning actually causing fires, it can be through canopy strikes, but it's actually sometimes even through early or late season strikes when leaves have come off the trees. You may have a lightning strike the ground, and in a lot of areas through the boreal forest, we have a high amount of organic matter in the soil. So things like peatlands, a lot of forest stuff, a lot of potentially burnable fuel in the ground, but it's fuel that can smolder and burn slowly. And some of those lightning strikes that have happened can create those ground fires that may smolder for, in fact, months before you have conditions correct in the forest itself for that to develop into like a fire that you can see with open flame. So it's tremendously interesting, and I would advise anybody who's interested in this to look at a lightning strike map sometimes, because a lot of us don't realize how often lightning hits the earth. Most of it never turns into a fire, but some of it does. And whenever we see a lot of lightning strikes, you know that your wildland fire managers are being aware of that and are looking at the conditions on the ground in those areas to see whether or not a lot of lightning strikes are potentially likely to cause a fire in those regions.
I was actually out hiking this morning and sat down to enjoy the view, and I noticed a tree, a big tall pine tree, and there was probably a 30-foot scar on the tree. It looked pretty fresh. and it just went straight down, and then it wrapped just gently around a branch and down, and then it left the tree. And I was just kind of baffled about, I couldn't imagine anything other than a lightning strike, and yet the tree was not burned. And it was just fascinating. So interesting to hear all the different conditions that would or would not cause a tree to ignite.
Yes, actually, on that matter, if you think about it in relation to, say, a match, if you ever tried to strike a dry match, you could have ignition. The phosphorus head could ignite, but you fail to actually get a flame because you don't have the right conditions with a wet match. So similar to that. There we go.
Interesting. Okay. So concern about the animals. Do they all tend to perish in the fire? You mentioned a little bit about that earlier, but is there anything to do to save the animals who are in the fire's path? Or do you know of anything that is being done?
Yeah, honestly, one of the things that we're doing to best address that is prescribed burning. Because when we talk about those different ranks of fires, like we did, picture a deer. Is a deer going to be better able to move away from a rank 2 or rank 3 or rank 4 fire or a rank 6 fire that's leaping ahead of it and sending fire bombs out and advancing on different fronts? Right? If we can have managed fires and be going through the normal reclamation part of that forest lifespan that requires fire and doing it in conditions that are not the kind that are going to lead to a massive fire, like very high droughts or so low moisture levels, lots of standing dead wood, waiting until the forest is very aged with lots of standing wood to burn. So we're doing that on a more managed level, therefore having a smaller, slower moving fire really allows, whether it's birds or whether it's mammals or even our little, snakes or frog friends, they're more able to remove themselves from that area when we have those smaller, more managed fires. And this is a big reason, in fact, why prescribed burning has been historically used in all these areas as part of a fire management system before we came along and didn't want to see those forests burn because it didn't seem right to us. So bringing that our knowledge of fire ecology and the way to keep that area low risk, both for us and for our animal friends, is going to be the best way forward with that. And that's the best advice I can give is supporting and understanding why those prescribed burns happen.
Yes. Well, thank you again. That was truly fascinating and so helpful. So, and I'm just echoing the comments from our viewers as well, who really appreciated it. I'm going to turn it back to you for closing comments.
Well, I'd just like to say thanks to everybody for coming in. I know that it's a topic that is both scary and fascinating. People are drawn to fires, yet are terrified of them, and I absolutely understand that duality, but I hope that a greater understanding and appreciation and knowledge of how it's an integral part of our planet's many ecosystems has brought us, a little bit more understanding of why it's important to know about these things. So thanks so much, and I hope everybody has a fantastic day and weekend.
I also want to thank everybody who tuned in. Please join us again tomorrow, or actually next week, for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You have a beautiful weekend in between, hopefully. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, we'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.